and welcome to this week's Sunday School. I got a request to look at and discuss the Book of Esther. So that's what we're going to do this week. The Book of Esther is interesting in that Esther becomes Queen of Persia. And Esther also prevents the killing of many of her people. Let's take a look at the story and see how that happened. Ahasuerus ruled over many provinces from India to Ethiopia. In the 3rd year of his reign, he had a banquet for his officials that lasted 180 days. And when he had finished, he then gave all the people in the land a banquet lasting 7 days. It was spectacular. The party had white and blue curtains tied with fine purple, linen, and silver rings that were attached to pillars of marble. There were couches of gold and precious stones everywhere, and drinks were served in golden goblets. Wow. In addition, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the palace. A week later, the king called for his wife to come to him, but she refused. After counseling with all of his officials, it was determined that since Queen Vashti refused to listen to the king, she would never be allowed to come before him again, and that in fact they felt that the king should put out a decree to choose another wife. They also felt that he should put out a decree that all men should be masters of their household, and women had to listen to their husband's request. Wonder how that would work today. Anyway, after a while, the king was no longer angry and was advised by his servants and other attendants to begin the search for a wife. And so he decided to do that with the help of Hegai. Now, there was a Jewish person in the palace of the king whose name was Mordecai. Mordecai had actually raised Esther because she grew up without a mom and a dad. And so he essentially adopted Esther. So when the king ordered that all young, fair, and beautiful women be brought to him to eventually choose a wife, Mordecai took Esther to the house where she would be in the custody of Hegai. Those the king chose would go to a place in the palace where they would receive special training related to their cosmetics, their skin care, and how to act like a queen. It even included special foods. This treatment was for 1 year. When the king saw Esther, he quickly chose her to be one of the 8 selected for his favorite list. Esther never revealed that she was Jewish. And while she was in this training, Mordecai checked on her daily. Now, while the women were in this year-long training, they would be called in to see the king from time to time. And when the women would go to see him, they were able to ask him for something that they wanted to take back with them to the palace. Interestingly enough, Esther never asked for a thing. It's also an interesting fact that I want you to remember is that women could only see the king upon his request. Remember that. This is going to come out later in the story as an interesting situation. Now, after being in this training for 10 months, Esther was called to the king, and he immediately fell in love with her, and he set the royal crown on her head, making her queen instead of Vashti. The king then had another great banquet. It was actually called Esther's Banquet. And I have a picture from a 1600 artist that I would like for you to see. Get it situated. He granted a holiday to the people of the kingdom and gave a lot of gifts. Esther remained silent about her being Jewish, as Mordecai had instructed her to do. One day, while at the king's gate, Mordecai overheard two of the king's servants plotting to kill him. Mordecai quickly informed Queen Esther of what he had heard, and upon investigation, these two men were killed. After this happened, the king put a man named Haman in charge of all his officials. Haman expected all the servants and other officials to bow down to him, but Mordecai would not bow down. And at some point, the servants also found out that Mordecai was Jewish. The fact that Mordecai would not bow down to him infuriated Haman. When Haman found out that Mordecai was Jewish, he set out to destroy all the Jewish people throughout the kingdom of the king. Haman then went to the king and told him that there were certain people in the land that didn't follow the laws that he set forth, and that he, Haman, would pay the king lots of money if the king would allow him to put an end to the Jewish people. Not knowing the truth, the king agreed. So a decree went out that all Jewish people, men, women, and children, were to be killed, and all that they had was to be destroyed. When Mordecai learned of this decree, he dressed in sackcloth and tore it as a symbol of his utter despair. Esther found out about the decree and asked for Mordecai to come to report to her. She sent him clothes with which he could enter the palace, but he refused. So Esther sent Hakoth, one of her servants, to Mordecai to find out what was happening. Mordecai gave the servant all the news and the written decree issued for the Jewish people's destruction. Now Esther knew that if she went to the king without him calling for her, she could be killed. Remember me telling you that no one was allowed to see the king unless he had called for them. But with Mordecai's suggestion, Esther decided to go, even if it meant her own death. But before going to the king, Esther asked Mordecai to go to the people and ask them to go without food and to pray for 3 days and nights. She asked her maids to do the same. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace. The king was sitting on his throne. As soon as the king saw Esther, he held out his golden scepter that was in his hand, welcoming her to come to him. Queen Esther asked the king if she could prepare a banquet for him and Haman. The king immediately agreed and sent for Haman. While they were eating, the king said to Esther, "What is it that you want? I will grant it." Esther again asked if she would be allowed to prepare a banquet for the king and Haman. When Haman walked out of the palace gate, there stood Mordecai, who again refused to bow down to him, which again made him very angry. After speaking with his friends, Haman decided to have gallows built, from which he would have Mordecai hung. That night the king could not sleep, so he asked for his record book. And looking at the book, he remembered how Mordecai had saved his life by telling him about the two servants who had plotted to kill him. And he decided to have him rewarded with fine robes and horses ridden through the streets. And who was to make all this happen for Mordecai? But Haman, the very villain who had planned on hanging Mordecai. So Haman made that happen, much to his own despair, and the warning from his friends now told him that he would not prevail against Mordecai. So the king and Haman go to the feast of Queen Esther. And on the second day, the king again asked Esther what she wanted in return for such a wonderful feast. So Esther asked the king to save her life and the life of all of her people. She revealed that Haman had created a deception about her people. And as the king's anger grew, Haman was removed and hung on the gallows that he had built to hang Mordecai. The king then told Esther that he agreed with her request and put Mordecai in charge. Mordecai wrote a new decree undoing the law to destroy the Jewish people, and Mordecai went out before the people dressed in royal robes as they rejoiced. So this is a story that has a lot of tragedy and potential for terrible destruction of lots of people. But because of Esther and her willingness to go to the king, even though it could have meant her own life, they were saved. This story is a part of the Jewish festival of Purim. And this is when we see the little three-cornered cookies called Hamantaschen. I have a feeling that somewhere along the line I have introduced you to these cookies when we were together in Sunday school. We usually see these cookies sometime in February. And it helps us to remember Esther's determination to save her people from the destruction with the help of Mordecai and God's plan. So this was a long story. It required a long attention span on your part. I hope you got through it. So, what is our take-home message or messages? One of them could be that it is important to listen to the advice of someone who is wise and has years of experience to help us with some of our decisions. It's also important to be brave and step out in faith. Fear is not always a reason to do nothing. Sometimes we need to think to help deal with our emotions. It is good to use whatever advantages or resources we have to help others. Esther, being queen, was in a good position to go to the king to inquire about saving her people. God has plans that we don't always understand until sometime later. And my favorite, if God wants something to happen, it will happen. The tricky part is what role do we play in the process? I hope this has been a fun, interesting, and educational story for you. Think about it during the week. And again, I ask you that if you have a favorite story that you want me to go over during our Sunday school time together, please email me that story and I will look it up and do my best to get that back to you. I hope you have a good week. Take care. See you next time.